3 days before her wedding, my granddaughter looked me in the eye and said, "Grandma Vivian, please don't embarrass me at my wedding." I stood there in stunned silence. But what I did next at that altar left the entire congregation speechless. I'm grateful you're here. Follow my story to the end and comment which state you're watching from so I can see how far this reaches. I never imagined that at 70 years old, my own granddaughter would make me feel like a moth-eaten fabric scrap unworthy of her designer showcase. Standing in the opulent bridal suite of the Meridian Palace Hotel in Charleston that Tuesday afternoon, watching Sophia finalize her wedding preparations with her team of luxury coordinators, I thought I was there to offer the gentle guidance that grandmothers had provided brides for generations. How foolishly optimistic I was. My name is Vivian Adelaide Montgomery, and I've weathered more storms than the ancient oak trees that line the streets of my hometown in Sweetwater Valley, Tennessee. Born in 1954 to a family that understood hardship as intimately as breathing, I learned early that respect isn't inherited. It's earned through grit, maintained through character, and defended when necessary. I worked as a master seamstress for 47 years, my fingers dancing across fabric with the precision of a surgeon, creating beauty from raw materials, while my own dreams remained carefully folded away like precious cloth saved for special occasions that never came. Life dealt me a devastating blow when my beloved husband Edgar was killed in a textile mill accident in 1987, leaving me to raise 3 children on a seamstress's modest wages. The insurance settlement was laughable, barely enough to cover the funeral expenses, so I took on additional work. Night shifts at the local dry cleaner, weekend alterations for the wealthy families in the historic district, holiday seasons spent creating elaborate costumes for the community theater. Every dollar earned was sacred. Every sacrifice calculated to give my children opportunities I'd never had. Sophia was my middle daughter Rebecca's child, and from the moment she drew her first breath, she was extraordinary. Even as a toddler, she had an eye for color and texture that amazed me. While other children played with blocks, Sophia arranged fabric scraps into elaborate patterns. By age 8, she was sketching dress designs that showed genuine artistic vision. I recognized her gift immediately and nurtured it with the same devotion I'd once reserved for my own abandoned dreams of fashion design. When Sophia was accepted to the prestigious Parsons School of Design in New York City, the financial reality was crushing. The tuition alone was more than I made in 2 years. Without hesitation, I refinanced my small house, the home Edgar and I had saved for decades to buy, and took on crushing debt to fund her education. When she graduated and wanted to launch her own luxury fashion line, Sterling Atelier, I liquidated my retirement savings, cashed in my life insurance policies, and mortgaged everything I owned to provide her startup capital. I told myself it was an investment in family legacy. Sophia had the talent and vision I'd never been able to pursue, and I wanted to see those dreams flourish in ways mine never could. By age 31, Sophia had transformed Sterling Atelier into a fashion powerhouse. Her evening gowns graced red carpets from Los Angeles to Paris. Her business suits were worn by Fortune 500 CEOs and political leaders. Her boutique wedding dress collection was featured in every major bridal magazine, with prices that started at $15,000 and soared well into 6 figures for her most elaborate creations. Sophia lived in a penthouse apartment in Manhattan's Tribeca neighborhood, owned a weekend house in the Hamptons, and traveled the world sourcing the finest materials money could buy. She'd appeared on the cover of Vogue, been profiled in Forbes as one of America's most successful young entrepreneurs, and built a brand that was synonymous with elegance, exclusivity, and uncompromising quality. I was proud of every stitch of her success. When fashion magazines featured her story, they occasionally mentioned her humble beginnings and her grandmother who had helped support her dreams, but those details were quickly glossed over in favor of focusing on her meteoric rise in the industry. What they never mentioned, what Sophia herself seemed to have forgotten, was that her success had been built on the foundation of my sacrifice.
The double shifts I'd worked to pay her design school expenses, the sleepless nights I'd spent taking in alterations to cover her living expenses in New York City, the years I'd gone without new clothes, without vacations, without any luxury beyond basic necessities, so that she could chase her dreams without the burden of student loans or startup debt.
I told myself it was natural. Successful young people grew beyond their childhood influences. They developed sophisticated tastes and social circles that reflected their achievements. It wasn't personal, it was simply evolution. But deep down, I felt the sting of being outgrown, discarded like last season's trends. What Sophia didn't know, what no one in our family knew, was that her old-fashioned grandmother from rural Tennessee had been sitting on secrets that would reshape everything she thought she understood about fashion, family, and the true source of creative brilliance. 8 months earlier, while cleaning out my late mother-in-law's attic following her death at age 96, I'd discovered something extraordinary hidden beneath decades of dust and neglect. A cedar chest I'd never seen before, sealed with old-fashioned metal clasps and bearing the initials EVM in faded gold leaf. Inside that chest was a treasure trove that would have made fashion historians weep with joy. Over 40 original dress patterns, meticulously hand-drawn on tissue paper, created by my husband's grandmother, Evangeline Victoria Montgomery, in the 1920s and 1930s. Each pattern was accompanied by detailed sketches, fabric swatches, and construction notes written in Evangeline's precise copperplate handwriting. As I carefully spread the patterns across my kitchen table, I realized I was looking at the work of a master couturier. These weren't simple home sewing patterns. They were sophisticated designs that showed advanced understanding of draping, construction, and fit. The sketches revealed gowns of breathtaking elegance, beaded evening wear that captured the glamour of the jazz age, day dresses that perfectly balanced practicality with style, wedding gowns that were architectural marvels of lace and silk. But the patterns were only the beginning of the discovery. Beneath the designs, I found Evangeline's journals, 5 leather-bound volumes that documented not just her creative process, but her remarkable life story. A story that had been lost to family history, buried beneath decades of modest circumstances and rural living. Evangeline Victoria Montgomery hadn't just been a talented seamstress. She'd been one of New York's most sought-after couturiers in the 1920s, creating custom gowns for the wives of robber barons, Broadway stars, and European royalty visiting America. Her salon on Fifth Avenue had been featured in Harper's Bazaar and Vogue. Her designs had influenced an entire generation of American fashion. According to the journals, Evangeline had been forced to abandon her New York career in 1929 when the stock market crash devastated her wealthy clientele. She'd returned to Tennessee, married my husband's grandfather, and spent the rest of her life creating beautiful clothes for the women of Sweetwater Valley, never speaking of her glamorous past. The journals contained detailed accounts of her design philosophy, her construction techniques, and most remarkably, her interactions with the powerful women who wore her creations. She'd dressed suffragettes preparing for political rallies, society wives launching charitable foundations, actresses breaking barriers in Hollywood, and businesswomen pioneering female entrepreneurship. Evangeline hadn't just created fashion, she'd created armor for women who were changing the world. As I read her journals late into the night, I realized I was holding not just family history, but American cultural history. These patterns and documents represented a missing link in the evolution of American couture, created by a woman whose contributions had been erased by economic circumstance and the passage of time. Over the following months, I'd quietly researched Evangeline's work, consulting with fashion historians and archivists who confirmed what I'd suspected. These patterns and journals were priceless. Museums would fight for the opportunity to display them. Fashion houses would pay millions for the rights to reproduce the designs.
Academic institutions would treasure them as primary source documents of American fashion history. But their value went beyond money. They represented a legacy of female creativity and empowerment that connected directly to Sophia's work. The DNA of Evangeline's revolutionary designs could be traced through the generations to Sophia's modern creations. The fearless innovation that had made Evangeline successful in the 1920s was the same spirit that drove Sophia's contemporary success. I'd been planning to share this discovery with Sophia for months, imagining how thrilled she'd be to learn that her talent wasn't just individual brilliance, it was inherited genius, passed down through generations of strong women who'd used fashion to empower themselves and others. I'd pictured presenting the patterns to her as an early wedding gift, perhaps creating a museum exhibition that would cement her place in fashion history while honoring our family creative legacy. I'd imagined how meaningful it would be for her to wear something inspired by Evangeline's designs on her wedding day, connecting past and present in a celebration of family tradition and artistic excellence. But standing in that bridal suite on Tuesday afternoon, listening to Sophia discuss her wedding plans with the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd forgotten where she came from, I was beginning to understand that my granddaughter had lost something essential during her climb to the top.
Grandma Vivian, you understand this is going to be an extremely sophisticated affair, Sophia was saying, her attention focused on a seating chart rather than on me. The guest list includes Anna Wintour, several Marchesa executives, the creative directors from 3 major fashion houses, and at least a dozen celebrities who wear my designs regularly. The media coverage will be extensive, and every detail will be scrutinized. I nodded quietly, smoothing my simple periwinkle dress, the nicest outfit in my closet, purchased from Dillard's with a senior discount and carefully altered to fit my aging frame. The bridal suite was a monument to luxury that would have impressed even Evangeline's wealthiest 1920s clients. Crystal chandelier light caught the gold threads and fabric samples scattered across antique tables. Sophia's wedding dress, her own design, naturally, hung from a specially designed mannequin, its hand-beaded bodice and yards of imported French lace representing months of work by master seamstresses in her New York atelier. The dress was undeniably beautiful, but as I looked at it, I couldn't help thinking about the simple elegance of Evangeline's wedding gown patterns, designs that achieved breathtaking beauty through pure line and proportion rather than expensive embellishment. Sophia's fiancé, Alexander Worthington IV, emerged from the adjoining suite where he'd been reviewing last-minute details with the wedding planner. Alexander came from what polite society called old Charleston money. His family had owned shipping companies, rice plantations, and real estate developments for 6 generations. He was handsome in the patrician way, of men who'd never questioned their place in the world, successful in the effortless manner of those born into established wealth, and exactly the kind of husband who would elevate Sophia's social status to match her financial achievements. "Vivian," Alexander said with the kind of hearty enthusiasm that wealthy people use when interacting with their spouse's less advantaged relatives, "how are you managing with all this wedding madness? I imagine it's quite different from the simple ceremonies you're used to in small-town Tennessee." The condescension was polished but unmistakable. Simple ceremonies, small-town Tennessee. As if my life experiences were quaint artifacts from a simpler time, charming in their innocence but irrelevant to sophisticated modern life. "I'm doing just fine, Alexander," I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I've seen my share of elegant celebrations over the years." Sophia glanced between us with the nervous energy of someone managing delicate social dynamics. She looked stunning, of course. Her pre-wedding skincare routine probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 6 months, but there was tension in her perfectly manicured posture. "Grandma, I need to discuss something important with you," she said, gesturing for me to join her on the silk-upholstered settee positioned near the suite's floor-to-ceiling windows. "I want to make sure we're on the same page about tomorrow." I settled beside her, noting how she arranged herself so we weren't quite touching, maintaining a subtle physical distance that spoke volumes about emotional distance. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Sophia took a breath that seemed calculated for maximum diplomatic impact.
I want you to know how much I love you and appreciate everything you've done for me over the years. Your support has been instrumental in my success. Instrumental, not foundational, not sacrificial, not transformative. Instrumental, like a useful tool that had served its purpose. But tomorrow is incredibly important for my career, she continued. This wedding isn't just a personal celebration, it's a major business event. The guest list includes people who can make or break careers in fashion. The networking opportunities are invaluable. The publicity will shape how my brand is perceived for years to come. I listened carefully, recognizing the tone. This was Sophia preparing to set boundaries, establish expectations, manage potential complications, just like Benjamin Blackwood had done with his elderly mother. I understand the wedding is important to you professionally. Good, because I need you to understand that the other guests tomorrow are going to be very different from the people you usually socialize with. They're going to be discussing things like international fashion weeks, multi-million-dollar business deals, art collections, European estates, conversations that might be challenging for someone from your background to navigate. Someone from your background. The phrase hit like a precisely placed pin, small but devastating. Sophia, are you asking me not to participate in conversations with your other guests? She looked genuinely uncomfortable, as if she hated having to articulate what she clearly felt was necessary. I'm asking you to be strategic about the impression you make. Maybe focus on safe topics, like, I don't know, gardening or cooking or local Tennessee history, things that won't accidentally create awkward moments or misunderstandings. The irony was breathtaking. I was being instructed to hide the very experiences that had made Sophia's success possible. The years of seamstress work that had taught me more about fabric, construction, and design than most fashion school graduates would ever learn. The decades of creating custom pieces for demanding clients that had given me insights into luxury that rivaled any industry professional. The deep knowledge of fashion history that I'd accumulated through a lifetime of studying the craft I loved but could never fully pursue.
Also, Sophia continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, please don't try to give any kind of speech or toast. I know you probably have family stories you'd like to share, but tomorrow's audience really isn't right for that kind of personal reminiscence. Don't embarrass me. She hadn't said the words directly, but the message was crystal clear. I stared at my granddaughter, this brilliant young woman I'd helped raise, whose dreams I'd funded with my life savings, whose success I'd celebrated as if it were my own, and realized that I'd become exactly what Eleanor Blackwood had been in that other story, an inconvenience, a potential source of embarrassment, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be honored. I see, I said quietly, but I didn't see at all. I didn't see how someone I'd loved unconditionally, supported without reservation, and sacrificed for without complaint could look me in the eye and ask me to make myself invisible on one of the most important days of her life. Alexander returned to his seating charts, Sophia resumed her consultation with the wedding planner, and I sat in that opulent suite feeling smaller than I had since Edgar's funeral 37 years earlier. As the afternoon wore on, I listened to discussions about flower arrangements that cost more than my monthly income, menu selections that featured ingredients I'd never heard of, and entertainment choices that reflected a world I supposedly couldn't understand or appreciate. But what struck me most wasn't the luxury. I'd created beautiful things my entire life and could appreciate quality and craftsmanship regardless of price. What struck me was the complete absence of any acknowledgement that I belonged in this story, that my contributions had value, that my presence was wanted rather than merely tolerated. When the wedding planner began reviewing the ceremony timeline, I learned that I'd been assigned to walk down the aisle alone, seated in the third row rather than the front row reserved for immediate family. When they discussed the reception, I discovered that I'd been placed at a table with distant relatives and family friends rather than with Sophia's professional associates or Alexander's prominent family members. Every decision reinforced the same message. You are peripheral, not central. You are tolerated, not celebrated.
You are part of the past we've moved beyond, not the future we're building. As I left the bridal suite that evening, walking through the hotel's marble lobby toward my rental car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Not just hurt or disappointment, but a kind of righteous anger that had been building quietly for months as I watched Sophia's success distance her from the family that had made it possible. What Sophia didn't know was that her embarrassing grandmother from small-town Tennessee had been sitting on family secrets that would transform everything she thought she understood about fashion, legacy, and the true source of creative genius. Secrets that connected her modern success to a heritage of female empowerment and artistic brilliance that stretched back generations. Secrets that I was now seriously considering sharing with her wedding guests in ways she definitely hadn't anticipated. As I drove through Charleston's historic streets toward my modest bed and breakfast, passing antebellum mansions and designer boutiques that represented the sophisticated world Sophia now inhabited, I made a decision that would alter the trajectory of our family forever. Sophia had asked me not to embarrass her at her wedding. Tomorrow, she was going to discover that her grandmother had very different ideas about what constituted embarrassment and what constituted honor. Tomorrow, the congregation gathered at St. Philip's Episcopal Church was going to learn about Evangeline Victoria Montgomery, the forgotten fashion pioneer whose revolutionary designs had influenced an entire generation. And tomorrow, Sophia Sterling was going to understand that underestimating the woman who'd sacrificed everything for her success was the biggest mistake she'd ever made. Because I wasn't just Vivian Montgomery, the small-town seamstress who'd been relegated to the margins of her granddaughter's success story. I was the keeper of a fashion legacy that would make Sophia's current achievements look like the opening chapter of a much larger book. And it was time to turn the page. The drive back to my bed and breakfast took me through the heart of historic Charleston, past the very neighborhoods where I'd once dreamed of opening my own couture salon. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, dismissed as an embarrassment by my granddaughter, while traveling streets lined with the kind of elegant boutiques I could have operated if life had dealt me different cards. My room at the Magnolia Inn was modest but comfortable, a far cry from the luxury suites where wedding parties typically stayed. Sophia had offered to pay for upgraded accommodations at the Meridian Palace, but I'd declined, sensing that her generosity came with strings attached. Better to maintain my independence than to feel beholden to someone who clearly saw me as a charity case. As I settled into the antique rocking chair by the window, I found myself thinking about the woman I'd been before life taught me to make myself smaller, before widowhood and financial struggle had convinced me that my dreams were luxuries I couldn't afford, before I'd learned to channel my creative ambitions through other people's success instead of pursuing my own.
You just have to be brave enough to let them. And sometimes, being brave enough to accept help is the first step toward becoming the person you were always meant to be, someone who knows their own worth and refuses to settle for anything less. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of my chosen family, even if we've never met. And if you're planning a wedding and you're worried about family drama, remember, the only people who belong at your wedding are the people who want to celebrate your love, not control it. Everything else is just noise. I hadn't always been the accommodating grandmother willing to fade into the background. There was a time when Vivian Montgomery had been a force to be reckoned with, a woman whose talent commanded respect and whose vision inspired others. That woman had been buried under decades of sacrifice and compromise, but she wasn't dead. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to resurface. The story of how I'd become Sophia's convenient fairy godmother, funding her dreams while abandoning my own, began long before she was born. It started with a young woman's ambitions being crushed by circumstances beyond her control, dreams deferred until they became dreams denied. I was 22 in 1976 when I married Edgar Montgomery, fresh out of design school in Atlanta with a head full of ideas and a portfolio that had impressed my professors. Edgar was a good man, steady, kind, devoted, but he came from a world where women's careers were viewed as hobbies, pleasant diversions until motherhood claimed their full attention. When I showed him my sketches for a potential fashion line, Edgar smiled indulgently and patted my hand. "That's nice, honey, but once we start having babies, you'll have plenty to keep you busy." I'd convinced myself that he was being practical, not dismissive. We were young, finances were tight, and starting a fashion business required capital we didn't have. I could pursue my creative interests later, once we were established. There would be time for dreams after we'd built the foundation of a stable life together. Rebecca arrived in 1978, followed by Thomas Jr. in 1980 and Sarah in 1983. Edgar worked at the Sweetwater Valley Textile Mill, earning steady wages that covered our basic needs but left no room for luxuries like pursuing impractical artistic ambitions. I took in sewing and alterations to supplement his income, telling myself that creating custom pieces for local women was just another form of design work. But it wasn't the same, and I knew it. Instead of creating cutting-edge fashion for sophisticated clients, I was hemming curtains and taking in waistbands for small-town housewives. Instead of seeing my designs in fashion magazines, I was repairing tears in work clothes and letting out seams in church dresses. The dreams didn't die immediately. They faded gradually, like fabric left too long in direct sunlight, until what had once been vibrant ambition became washed-out resignation. When Edgar died in that mill accident in 1987, I was 33 years old with 3 children under 10 and no savings to speak of. The life insurance settlement was insulting, barely enough to cover funeral costs and a few months of basic expenses. I was faced with a choice that no young mother should have to make: pursue my own dreams or sacrifice everything to ensure my children had opportunities I'd never had. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. I took on more alterations work, added night shifts at the dry cleaner, started creating elaborate costumes for the community theater, anything that would generate income while allowing me to be present for my children. My sewing machine ran from dawn until late into the night, its steady rhythm becoming the soundtrack of survival. Years blended together in a haze of school events, work deadlines, and financial calculations that never quite balanced. Rebecca showed early aptitude for mathematics and business. Thomas Jr. excelled in sports and leadership. Sarah discovered a talent for music. I channeled all my creative energy into supporting their individual gifts, living vicariously through their achievements, while my own artistic ambitions gathered dust in boxes stored in the closet. By the time Sophia was born in 1992, I'd been a widow for 5 years and had perfected the art of selfless martyrdom. Rebecca had married young, too young, perhaps, but David Sterling was a decent man with steady work and they were deeply in love. When Sophia arrived, she represented a fresh start, a new generation where dreams might be possible again. From the moment I first held her, Sophia was different. Where other babies seemed content to sleep and eat, she was constantly observing, absorbing, processing the world around her with an intensity that was almost unsettling. By age 2, she was arranging objects by color and pattern with the precision of a trained designer. By 4, she was creating elaborate dress-up scenarios that demonstrated an intuitive understanding of style and presentation. When Sophia was 6, Rebecca brought her to my sewing room while I worked on alterations. Most children that age would have been bored by the mundane tasks of hemming and seaming, but Sophia was fascinated. She watched every stitch, asked detailed questions about fabric choices and construction techniques, and began sketching her own dress designs on scraps of paper. "Grandma Vivian," she said one afternoon, holding up a drawing that showed remarkable sophistication for a child her age, "could you teach me to make this?" Looking at her sketch, a princess dress with clever construction details that would actually work in real life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: recognition. This child understood design in ways that couldn't be taught, only nurtured. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Edgar's death. I pulled out my old design school portfolios, dusty boxes filled with sketches and fabric samples, and dreams that had been stored away like seasonal decorations. Sophia spent hours studying every page, asking questions that revealed an artistic vision far beyond her chronological age.
"These are beautiful, Grandma," she said, carefully handling a sketch I'd created for my senior thesis project. "Why didn't you become a famous designer?" The question hit with unexpected force. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that life doesn't always accommodate dreams? That sometimes circumstances require you to choose between personal fulfillment and family responsibility? "Life got complicated, sweetheart," I said finally, "but maybe you can do the things I never got to do." It was the moment when Sophia's dreams became my dreams, when her potential became my redemption. From that day forward, I poured all my artistic energy into nurturing her talent, teaching her everything I'd learned about design, construction, and the business of creating beauty. As Sophia grew older, her gift became undeniable. Teachers recognized her artistic ability, other parents commented on her natural style sense, and fashion magazines became her constant companions. She absorbed influences like a sponge, studying haute couture collections, analyzing construction techniques, developing opinions about designers and trends that would have impressed fashion school professors. When she was 14, Sophia created her first truly sophisticated piece, a cocktail dress for her school's winter formal that incorporated draping techniques she'd learned from studying 1930s Hollywood glamour. The dress was featured in the local newspaper's society section, and suddenly everyone in Sweetwater Valley knew that Rebecca Sterling's daughter had exceptional talent. By her junior year of high school, it was clear that Sophia needed more advanced training than our small town could provide. She'd outgrown my ability to teach her, exhausted the resources available at school, and begun chafing against the limitations of rural Tennessee's fashion scene. When she mentioned Parsons School of Design during a family dinner, I could see the longing in her eyes. She tried to present it casually, as just one option among many, but I recognized the hunger. It was the same yearning I'd felt as a young woman looking at fashion magazines and dreaming of creating clothes that would appear in their pages. The financial reality was crushing. Parsons' tuition for 4 years would cost more than I'd made in the previous decade. Even with financial aid, and Sophia's portfolio was strong enough to qualify for scholarships, the remaining expenses were far beyond our family's resources. That night, alone in my sewing room, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I pulled out the mortgage papers for my house, called the bank the next morning, and began the process of refinancing everything I owned to fund Sophia's education. Edgar and I had spent 15 years paying off our modest home. It represented security, stability, the one asset that would ensure I'd never be homeless in my old age. Signing those refinancing documents felt like jumping off a cliff, trusting that love and faith would provide a safe landing. But watching Sophia's face when I told her that Parsons was financially possible, seeing the tears of joy, the explosion of gratitude, the immediate burst of creative energy as she began planning her portfolio submission, I knew I'd made the right choice. Sophia threw herself into her Parsons application with the intensity of someone who understood that dreams were fragile things that required fierce protection. Her portfolio was stunning, her essays passionate, her interview confident and articulate. When the acceptance letter arrived, accompanied by a partial scholarship offer, we celebrated like we'd won the lottery. The 4 years that followed were a masterclass in financial sacrifice. Sophia's living expenses in New York, even with her scholarship, strained my resources to the breaking point. I took on additional work, weekend catering jobs, holiday alterations for the wealthy families who could afford elaborate party wardrobes, custom sewing projects that kept my machine running 18 hours a day. I sold Edgar's tools, his truck, anything of value that wasn't essential for daily survival. I canceled my own modest insurance policies, deferred maintenance on my house, wore clothes until they literally fell apart. Every luxury, every comfort, every non-essential expense was eliminated so that Sophia could pursue the dreams that had once been mine. During her sophomore year, Sophia called home with excitement about an internship opportunity at a prestigious fashion house. Unpaid, of course, but the experience would be invaluable for her career development. The catch? She'd need to stay in New York for the summer instead of coming home to work and help offset her expenses. I didn't hesitate.
I picked up additional shifts, arranged to do alterations for a bridal shop in the next town, and somehow managed to cover her summer living expenses. When she called to tell me about the connections she was making, the techniques she was learning, the possibilities opening up for her future, I knew every sacrifice was worth it. Sophia graduated from Parsons with honors, a portfolio that impressed industry professionals, and job offers from 3 respected fashion houses. But she had bigger dreams than working for someone else. She wanted to start her own label, create her own designs, build something that belonged entirely to her. The startup costs were staggering. Equipment, materials, workspace, marketing, legal fees. The estimate she showed me totaled more than I'd made in 5 years. Traditional investors weren't interested in an unknown designer with no track record, regardless of her talent and vision.
Once again, I became the solution to Sophia's financial challenges. I cashed in my retirement savings, money I'd been accumulating since Edgar's death, planning for the day when I'd be too old to work. I took out a second mortgage on my house, leveraging every dollar of equity I'd built over decades of payments. The day I wrote the check that would launch Sterling Atelier, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in Sophia's accomplishments, excitement about her potential, and underneath it all, a quiet mourning for the security I was trading away to fund someone else's dreams. But Sophia's success validated every sacrifice. Within 3 years, Sterling Atelier had gained recognition in fashion circles. Within 5 years, her designs were being worn by celebrities and featured in major magazines. Within 8 years, she'd built a multi-million-dollar business that employed dozens of people and influenced fashion trends across the country. I followed her career with the devoted attention of someone whose own dreams had been transferred wholesale to another person. Every magazine feature, every celebrity endorsement, every business milestone felt like personal vindication. This was what my sacrifices had purchased. Not just Sophia's success, but proof that the artistic vision I'd never been able to pursue had been worth preserving and nurturing. As Sophia's business grew and her social circle expanded, I began to notice subtle changes in our relationship. The weekly phone calls where she'd sought my opinion on designs and business decisions became monthly updates where she shared her achievements. The visits home became shorter, more focused on family obligations than genuine connection. The eager student who'd once hung on every piece of advice I offered was replaced by a confident professional who no longer needed guidance from her small-town grandmother. I told myself these changes were natural, healthy signs of maturity and independence. Successful people necessarily grew beyond their early influences. It would have been selfish to expect Sophia to remain emotionally dependent on someone whose life experiences were so different from her current reality. But the distance hurt in ways I struggled to acknowledge. After investing so much of myself in Sophia's success, being gradually phased out of her life felt like watching my own dreams succeed while simultaneously being told they no longer belonged to me. The pattern became established over several years. Sophia would visit during major holidays, bringing expensive gifts that demonstrated her prosperity while subtly emphasizing the economic gap between us. She'd update me on her latest projects, describing collaborations with celebrities and business ventures worth millions, speaking about a world I could imagine but never inhabit. During these visits, I began to notice small signs of embarrassment about our family's modest circumstances. Sophia would steer conversations away from her childhood memories, gloss over references to the financial sacrifices that had funded her education, and carefully edit her success story to minimize the role of her working-class background. When fashion magazines profiled her career, they occasionally mentioned her humble beginnings and the family support that had helped her succeed, but these references were brief and sanitized. The reality of my mortgage refinancing, retirement fund liquidation, and years of financial struggle was transformed into generic statements about family sacrifices that could have applied to anyone. I understood the impulse to reframe the narrative. Sophia had worked incredibly hard to build her success, and her talent was undeniable. She deserved full credit for her achievements, and dwelling on family financial support might diminish recognition of her individual brilliance. But understanding didn't eliminate the sting of watching my contributions be minimized or erased from the story. When people praised Sophia's self-made success, I felt the complex pride of someone whose sacrifices had been essential but were no longer considered worth acknowledging. The transformation became most apparent when Sophia began dating Alexander. His family represented everything she aspired to join: generational wealth, social prominence, cultural sophistication that didn't need to be earned because it was inherited. When she brought him to Tennessee for the first time, I could see her viewing our small town through his eyes, cataloging all the ways our modest lifestyle might appear quaint or backward to someone from his background. During that visit, Sophia made subtle but unmistakable efforts to manage my interactions with Alexander. She'd redirect conversations when I mentioned my seamstress work, changed subjects when I shared stories about her childhood, and gently discouraged me from showing him examples of my own design work or her early sketches. The message was clear. My contributions to her story were now viewed as potential embarrassments rather than sources of pride. As I sat in that Charleston bed and breakfast room, reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this moment, I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd made a fundamental mistake. I'd allowed my own identity to become completely subsumed into Sophia's success. I'd traded away not just my financial security and retirement plans, but my sense of self-worth and personal agency. In nurturing Sophia's dreams, I'd systematically abandoned my own. In funding her future, I sacrificed not just money, but the possibility of pursuing my own delayed ambitions. In celebrating her achievements, I accepted the role of supporting character in a story where I'd once been the protagonist.
But sitting there in the lamplight, surrounded by the fabric samples and sketches I'd brought to Charleston, I felt something stirring that I hadn't experienced in decades. Not just hurt or disappointment, but a kind of righteous anger mixed with renewed determination. The woman who'd cashed in her retirement savings to fund someone else's dreams wasn't weak or selfless. She was powerful. The grandmother who'd been dismissed as an embarrassment possessed knowledge, experience, and resources that could reshape everything Sophia thought she understood about success and family legacy. Most importantly, the seamstress who'd been told to remain invisible at her granddaughter's wedding was the keeper of secrets that would transform not just one family's story, but fashion history itself. Tomorrow, Sophia would marry Alexander in a ceremony designed to showcase her sophisticated taste and social connections. She'd surround herself with fashion industry luminaries, celebrities, and wealthy socialites who represented the pinnacle of success in her chosen field. But what none of them knew, what Sophia herself didn't know, was that the woman they'd relegated to the margins of the celebration possessed artifacts and knowledge that would make their achievements look like footnotes in a much larger story. I thought about Evangeline Victoria Montgomery's journals still hidden in my sewing room back in Sweetwater Valley. The detailed accounts of her interactions with suffragettes, society women, actresses, and entrepreneurs who'd worn her revolutionary designs. The construction techniques she developed that were decades ahead of their time. The business strategies she pioneered in an era when women's professional achievements were rarely acknowledged or preserved. I thought about the patterns themselves, 40 masterpieces of couture design that represented a missing chapter in American fashion history. Designs that could inspire contemporary collections, influence modern construction techniques, and establish new standards for what constituted true artistic innovation in fashion. And I thought about the legacy that connected Evangeline's pioneering work to Sophia's contemporary success, a legacy that my granddaughter was about to discover she'd been heir to all along. Tomorrow's wedding would be more than a social celebration. It would be a moment of reckoning, a confrontation between old values and new priorities, a test of whether success had permanently severed the connections between past and present. As I prepared for bed in that Charleston hotel room, I made plans that would ensure tomorrow's ceremony became something neither Sophia nor her sophisticated guests would ever forget.
The woman, who'd been told not to embarrass her granddaughter, was about to teach everyone present what true embarrassment looked like and what authentic honor could accomplish. Wednesday morning dawned gray and humid, typical Charleston weather that made the city's antebellum architecture look romantic and mysterious. I'd barely slept, my mind racing through memories, plans, and the weight of decisions that would alter the course of our family forever. By 5 a.m., I was dressed and sitting in the bed and breakfast's garden courtyard, nursing my second cup of coffee and reviewing the documents I'd brought from Tennessee. The manila folder in my lap contained photocopies of some of Evangeline Victoria Montgomery's most significant journals and pattern sketches, carefully selected pieces that represented just a fraction of the treasure trove hidden in my sewing room back home. I'd chosen these particular items not for their monetary value, though that was considerable, but for their potential to educate Sophia about the legacy she'd inherited and apparently forgotten. As the sun climbed higher over Charleston's historic district, casting long shadows through the Spanish moss that drapes the courtyard's ancient oak trees, I made a phone call that would set everything in motion. "Dr. Patricia Williamson, please. This is Vivian Montgomery calling." Dr. Williamson was the fashion historian at the Savannah College of Art and Design who'd authenticated Evangeline's pattern 6 months earlier. Her excitement upon first examining the sketches had been so genuine, so professional, that I'd known immediately I'd found the right expert to help me understand what I'd discovered. "Vivian, how wonderful to hear from you. I've been thinking about those extraordinary Montgomery patterns ever since our consultation. Have you made any decisions about publication or exhibition?" "Actually, Dr. Williamson, I'm calling about a more immediate matter. Would you be available to travel to Charleston today? I have a proposition that might interest you professionally." The pause that followed told me Patricia was intrigued. As one of the country's leading experts in American fashion history, she'd built her career on discoveries like Evangeline's work, forgotten designers whose contributions had been lost to time and circumstances. "What kind of proposition?" "I'd like you to present Evangeline Montgomery's work to a very select audience tomorrow evening. Fashion industry professionals, museum curators, journalists, people who would understand the historical significance and could help bring her story to the attention it deserves." "Vivian, that sounds incredible, but tomorrow is Thursday. Academic presentations require weeks of preparation, not hours." I smiled, sipping my coffee as I watched early morning joggers pass by on the cobblestone street beyond the garden courtyard. "Dr. Williamson, what if I told you that this particular presentation would take place at a wedding attended by Anna Wintour, the creative directors of 3 major fashion houses, and at least a dozen celebrities known for their fashion influence?"
Completely serious. My granddaughter is Sophia Sterling of Sterling Atelier. Tomorrow is her wedding, and the guest list reads like a who's who of American fashion. This would be an opportunity to introduce Evangeline's work to exactly the people who could ensure her legacy receives proper recognition. Sophia Sterling is your granddaughter? Vivian, why didn't you mention this connection when we first spoke? Because at the time, I thought family relationships were private matters that didn't need to complicate professional consultations. I'm beginning to revise that perspective. Patricia's excitement was building. I could hear it in her quickening speech pattern. This is extraordinary. The networking opportunities alone would be invaluable for establishing Evangeline's place in fashion history. But Vivian, I have to ask, does Sophia know about the patterns? Have you discussed this presentation with her? Sophia doesn't know about Evangeline's work yet. In fact, that's part of what makes tomorrow's presentation so potentially impactful. She's going to discover that her talent isn't just individual brilliance, it's inherited genius passed down through generations of creative women. And you want to surprise her with this information at her wedding reception? I could hear the uncertainty creeping into Patricia's voice, the academic's instinct for careful planning colliding with the dramatic possibilities I was proposing.
Dr. Williamson, let me be frank with you. My granddaughter has spent the past several years distancing herself from her family history because she views it as unsophisticated baggage that might diminish her professional image. Tomorrow's reception will be filled with people whose respect and acceptance she craves, people who value authentic artistic legacy above manufactured social credentials. I paused, letting that sink in. This presentation would accomplish several things simultaneously. It would establish Evangeline Montgomery as a significant figure in American fashion history. It would demonstrate that Sophia's creative abilities are rooted in a tradition of female artistic excellence. And it would show everyone present, including Sophia herself, that family legacy can be a source of pride rather than embarrassment. Patricia was quiet for nearly a minute, and I could practically hear her wrestling with the academic implications of what I was proposing. Finally, she spoke. Vivian, what you're describing is essentially an intervention disguised as a scholarly presentation. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Another pause. Not if it serves the cause of historical preservation and family reconciliation. Actually, it's rather brilliant. The fashion industry loves discovery stories, especially ones that connect contemporary success to forgotten pioneers. So you'll come to Charleston? I'll be there by this afternoon. But Vivian, I want you to understand what you're setting in motion. Once Evangeline's work is presented to this level of industry leadership, there will be no controlling how the story spreads. Museums will want exhibitions, fashion houses will want to license designs, journalists will want to write feature articles. Your family's private history is about to become very public. I thought about Sophia's request that I remain invisible, blend into the background, avoid saying anything that might embarrass her in front of her sophisticated guests. Dr. Williamson, I think it's time for our family's history to be public, the right kind of public. After hanging up with Patricia, I made my second crucial phone call of the morning. Magnolia Preservation Society, this is Caroline speaking. Hello, Caroline. This is Vivian Montgomery. I believe we spoke several months ago about the Montgomery family papers are discovered. Mrs. Montgomery, yes, of course I remember. You found those extraordinary 1920s couture patterns in your family archives. I've been hoping you'd contact us again about potential collaboration. Actually, I'm calling because I'll be in Charleston today and tomorrow. Would you be available to meet this afternoon to discuss a rather unique presentation opportunity? Certainly. What kind of presentation? The kind that would put the Magnolia Preservation Society at the forefront of a major fashion history discovery. The kind that would generate exactly the type of media attention and donor interest that cultural institutions dream about. I could hear Caroline's chair creaking as she leaned forward, her attention fully captured. Mrs. Montgomery, you have my complete interest. When and where would you like to meet? By noon, I had assembled what military strategists would call a coalition of forces. Dr. Patricia Williamson was driving down from Savannah with a collection of portable display materials and academic credentials that would lend scholarly weight to any presentation. Caroline Hutchinson was preparing promotional materials that would position the Magnolia Preservation Society as the cultural organization that had discovered Evangeline Montgomery's contributions to American fashion history. Most importantly, I had confirmed that tomorrow evening's wedding reception would include not just fashion industry luminaries, but also several journalists, museum curators, and cultural historians who attended Charleston social events as part of their professional networking.
The stage was set for a presentation that would simultaneously honor Evangeline's legacy, educate Sophia about her creative inheritance, and demonstrate to everyone present that the elderly woman they'd been prepared to dismiss possessed knowledge and resources that demanded respect. But first, I needed to make one more crucial preparation. At 2 p.m., I drove to the Charleston Museum's Textile Conservation Lab, where I'd arranged to meet with Dr. James Whitfield, the curator of decorative arts, who'd helped authenticate several pieces in Evangeline's collection. Mrs. Montgomery, James said, greeting me in the climate-controlled room where precious fabrics were preserved and studied. I've been eager to see more of your great-great-grandmother's work since our initial consultation. What brings you to Charleston?
Family wedding, I replied, setting my carefully protected portfolio on the examination table, but also an opportunity to share Evangeline's story with a broader audience. As I spread out selected patterns and journal pages, James's reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for. His professional composure gave way to genuine excitement as he studied the intricate construction details and read Evangeline's technical notes. "These construction techniques," he murmured, examining a pattern for an evening gown that incorporated architectural principles of stress distribution and weight balance. She was solving engineering problems that most designers didn't even recognize until decades later. "James, I need professional documentation of these pieces' significance, not for insurance or sale purposes, but for educational presentation. Tomorrow evening, I'll be introducing Evangeline's work to fashion industry leaders who need to understand exactly what they're looking at." James looked up from the patterns, his expression shifting from academic interest to something approaching awe. "Mrs. Montgomery, are you planning to donate these pieces to a museum collection?" "I'm planning to ensure they receive the recognition they deserve. Whether that eventually involves museum placement depends on several factors that will be determined tomorrow evening." I spent the next 2 hours working with James to create professional documentation of the most significant pieces. High-resolution photographs that captured every detail of Evangeline's sketches, technical analyses that explained her innovative construction methods, historical context that placed her work within the broader evolution of American fashion. By 4 p.m., I had assembled a presentation portfolio that would have impressed fashion history professors at any major university. More importantly, I had created materials that would make it impossible for anyone to dismiss Evangeline Montgomery as just another forgotten seamstress from a simpler time. As I left the Charleston Museum and drove toward my evening appointment with Caroline Hutchinson, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Not just anticipation or nervous energy, but the deep satisfaction of someone who was finally, after years of deferring and accommodating, taking decisive action to shape her own narrative. The meeting with Caroline took place at the Magnolia Preservation Society's elegant headquarters in a restored antebellum mansion on Meeting Street. Caroline had clearly done her research since our morning phone call. Her desk was covered with printouts about Sophia's career, Sterling Atelier's success, and tomorrow's wedding guest list. "Mrs. Montgomery," she said, gesturing for me to take a seat in the organization's formal parlor, "I've been researching your granddaughter's achievements, and I'm beginning to understand the scope of what you're proposing. This could be a watershed moment for fashion history preservation." I opened my portfolio and began showing Caroline the documentation James and I had prepared. Her reaction was immediate and gratifying, the kind of professional excitement that comes from recognizing a discovery with significant cultural and financial implications. "These are museum-quality pieces," she breathed, studying a photograph of Evangeline's most complex evening gown pattern. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary, but more than that, the innovation is decades ahead of its time." "Caroline, I want to propose a partnership. The Magnolia Preservation Society sponsors tomorrow evening's presentation, positions itself as the cultural organization that's bringing this discovery to public attention, and in return, you help me ensure that Evangeline's legacy receives proper institutional support." Caroline's business mind was clearly calculating the possibilities. What kind of institutional support? Museum exhibitions, academic symposiums, published scholarship, the kind of recognition that establishes historical figures as important contributors to American cultural development. And in return, the Magnolia Preservation Society gets credit for preserving and promoting a significant piece of American fashion history, the kind of discovery that generates donor interest, media coverage, and professional recognition for cultural institutions. Caroline leaned back in her chair, studying me with new appreciation. "Mrs. Montgomery, you're proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement that could transform how the fashion industry thinks about historical preservation. I'm proposing that tomorrow evening, a room full of fashion industry leaders discover that authentic artistic legacy is more valuable than manufactured social credentials. And I'm proposing that your organization gets credit for making that discovery possible." We spent the next hour working out the logistics.
Caroline would attend tomorrow's reception as the official representative of the Magnolia Preservation Society. Dr. Patricia Williamson would be introduced as the academic expert who'd authenticated Evangeline's work. I would be presented not as Sophia's embarrassing small-town grandmother, but as the family archivist who'd preserved and protected a significant collection of American fashion history. By 6 p.m., all the pieces were in place. Tomorrow's wedding reception would include an unscheduled presentation that would simultaneously honor Evangeline's legacy, educate Sophia about her creative inheritance, and demonstrate to everyone present that family history could be a source of professional pride rather than social embarrassment. But as I drove back to my bed and breakfast that evening, I realized that assembling coalition partners and documentation was only the beginning of what I needed to accomplish. The real challenge would be managing the emotional dynamics of confronting Sophia with information that would fundamentally alter how she thought about herself, her success, and our family relationships. That evening, alone in my hotel room, I did something I hadn't done since Edgar's funeral 37 years earlier. I called my sister Margaret in Phoenix and told her everything. "Vivian Adelaide Montgomery," Margaret said after I'd finished explaining my plans for tomorrow's reception, "are you having some kind of breakdown? Because what you're describing sounds like you're planning to ambush your own granddaughter at her wedding." "I'm planning to educate her about her heritage. There's a difference." "Is there? Honey, I understand that Sophia hurt your feelings with her comment about not embarrassing her, but don't you think a wedding reception is the wrong venue for family therapy?" Margaret had always been the practical sister, the one who approached problems with logic rather than emotion. Her skepticism forced me to articulate the deeper motivations behind my plans. "Margaret, this isn't about hurt feelings. This is about a young woman who's so ashamed of her family history that she's willing to pretend it doesn't exist. This is about someone who's benefited enormously from family sacrifices, but doesn't want those sacrifices acknowledged because they might diminish her image as a self-made success." "And you think surprising her with a presentation about great-great-grandmother's fashion designs is going to fix that?" "I think showing her, and her sophisticated friends, that our family has always produced creative brilliance will demonstrate that her talent comes from somewhere meaningful, that her success isn't diminished by acknowledging her roots, it's enhanced by understanding them." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentler. "Vivian, what if she's not ready to hear this? What if the presentation backfires and makes her more resentful rather than more appreciative?" The question struck at the heart of my deepest fears. What if Sophia viewed tomorrow's presentation as betrayal rather than gift? What if her reaction was anger and embarrassment rather than pride and gratitude? Then at least she'll understand that her grandmother isn't someone who can be dismissed or managed, that the woman who funded her dreams possesses resources and knowledge that demand respect. Even if that respect comes through fear rather than love? I looked out my hotel window at Charleston's evening lights, thinking about the years of accommodation and self-sacrifice that had brought us to this moment. "Margaret, I've spent the past 15 years earning Sophia's love through financial sacrifice and emotional accommodation. I've made myself smaller and smaller, less and less significant, in order to avoid creating any discomfort for her success story." I paused, feeling the weight of accumulated resentments that I'd been suppressing for years. Tomorrow, she's going to discover that love isn't the same thing as respect, and that someone who spent her entire life avoiding confrontation might be capable of creating consequences when pushed too far. After hanging up with Margaret, I spent the rest of the evening making final preparations for tomorrow's presentation. I reviewed Patricia's academic materials, studied Caroline's promotional strategies, and rehearsed the key points I wanted to make during my own portion of the presentation. But most importantly, I thought about Evangeline Victoria Montgomery herself, the woman whose hidden legacy was about to reshape our family story. Reading her journals over the past months had been like discovering a grandmother I'd never known I had. Evangeline's writing revealed a woman of extraordinary intelligence, creativity, and business acumen who'd navigated the fashion world of the 1920s with the confidence of someone who knew her own worth. Her clients hadn't just been wealthy women looking for beautiful clothes, they'd been pioneers, activists, and entrepreneurs who understood that fashion could be a form of power. Evangeline had dressed suffragettes preparing for political rallies, society wives launching charitable organizations, actresses breaking barriers in Hollywood, and businesswomen creating opportunities that had never existed before. Her designs hadn't just been beautiful, they'd been functional armor for women who were changing the world.
Reading about Evangeline's philosophy of fashion as empowerment, I began to understand that tomorrow's presentation wasn't just about family pride or historical preservation. It was about demonstrating that creative excellence, when combined with moral purpose, could create lasting impact that transcended individual achievement. Sophia had built Sterling Atelier into a successful business, but she'd lost sight of fashion's potential to empower and inspire. She'd become so focused on social acceptance and professional recognition that she'd forgotten the deeper purpose that great design could serve. Tomorrow's presentation would remind her, and everyone else present, that authentic artistic legacy wasn't about impressing wealthy clients or gaining celebrity endorsements. It was about creating beauty that served meaningful purposes, building success that lifted others rather than distancing oneself from community, and understanding that individual achievement was most significant when it honored the sacrifices and contributions that had made it possible. As I prepared for bed that Wednesday evening, I felt a complex mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Tomorrow would bring either reconciliation or permanent fracture in my relationship with Sophia. The presentation would either strengthen family bonds or destroy them entirely. But regardless of the personal consequences, tomorrow would also bring something that had been missing from our family story for too long: truth. The truth about Evangeline's extraordinary contributions to American fashion. The truth about the sacrifices that had funded Sophia's education and startup capital. The truth about what authentic success looked like when it was built on gratitude rather than shame, acknowledgement rather than denial, connection rather than disconnection. Tomorrow, Sophia Sterling and her sophisticated wedding guests would discover that the elderly woman they'd been prepared to dismiss as an embarrassment was actually the keeper of a legacy that would make their contemporary achievements look like opening chapters in a much larger book. And tomorrow, Vivian Montgomery would finally stop making herself invisible for other people's comfort. The woman who'd been told not to embarrass her granddaughter was about to teach everyone present what true embarrassment looked like and what authentic honor could accomplish when it was finally, after years of patience and accommodation, allowed to take center stage. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that makes Charleston feel like a city wrapped in wet velvet. I was awake before dawn, sitting in the bed and breakfast's courtyard with my fourth cup of coffee, watching the sky lighten over the historic district while my mind raced through final preparations for what would either be the most meaningful day of my life or the most catastrophic. Today was Sophia's wedding day. In 12 hours, she would walk down the aisle of St. Philip's Episcopal Church to marry Alexander Worthington III in front of Charleston's elite and fashion industry royalty. In 14 hours during the reception at the Harbor Club, I would either deliver a presentation that transformed our family's legacy or destroy my relationship with my granddaughter forever. The manila folder spread across the wrought iron table contained the culmination of months of research and years of suppressed resentment. Dr. Patricia Williamson's academic analysis of Evangeline Victoria Montgomery's contributions to American fashion. Caroline Hutchinson's promotional materials positioning the Magnolia Preservation Society as the cultural institution bringing this discovery to light. Dr. James Whitfield's professional authentication of pattern pieces worth more than most people's houses. But beneath all this scholarly documentation and institutional credibility lay something more personal and potentially more destructive:
My decision to stop being the accommodating grandmother who funded dreams and accepted dismissal in return. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Arrived at hotel. Presentation materials are extraordinary. This will change fashion history scholarship. Are you certain about timing? I typed back, completely certain. See you at 6 p.m. for final coordination. The certainty in my response surprised even me. 3 days ago, I'd been prepared to fade quietly into the background of Sophia's perfect wedding, playing the role of grateful relative who understood her proper place in the social hierarchy. Now I was orchestrating what amounted to a public intervention disguised as a scholarly presentation. What had changed wasn't just my tolerance for being dismissed, though Sophia's comment about not embarrassing her had certainly been the catalyst. What had changed was my understanding of what I owed myself after decades of selfless accommodation. What had changed was my recognition that enabling someone's shame about their family history wasn't love, it was complicity in their moral diminishment. At 8 a.m., my phone rang with a call I'd been expecting, but dreading. Grandma Vivian. Sophia's voice carried the particular strain of a bride managing last-minute details while trying to maintain perfect composure. This was the Sophia I'd watched develop over the years, the woman who'd learned to transform every challenge into a performance of effortless success.
I'm sure everything will work out beautifully, I said, meaning it despite the complicated feelings swirling beneath my words. That's actually why I'm calling. I wanted to thank you for being so understanding about our conversation the other day. I know I wasn't as gracious as I should have been about the guest dynamics and social expectations. The apology caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected. Sophia had always been thoughtful about smoothing over potential conflicts, but because of its timing. She was calling on her wedding morning to manage family relationships, ensuring that nothing would disrupt the careful choreography of her perfect day. Sophia, you don't need to apologize for wanting your wedding to go smoothly. I just want you to know that I do appreciate everything you've done for me over the years. I know I don't always express it well, especially when I'm stressed about business or social situations, but your support has meant everything to my success. Your support, not your sacrifices, not your belief in my dreams, not your willingness to mortgage your security for my education, your support, as if I'd been a cheerleader rather than the primary funder of her entire career. I'm glad I could help, I replied carefully. And Grandma, I'm really looking forward to seeing you at the church this afternoon. I know today is going to be perfect. Perfect. The word hung in the air after she hung up, carrying all the weight of Sophia's expectations and my conflicted intentions. She was envisioning a day where every detail unfolded according to plan, where family members played their assigned roles, where nothing unexpected disrupted the elegant narrative she'd constructed. In 6 hours, that vision of perfection was going to collide with my decision to stop accommodating other people's comfort at the expense of my own dignity. I spent the morning making final preparations that felt increasingly like preparing for battle. I pressed my navy dress, the one Sophia had diplomatically suggested would be appropriate for the grandmother of the bride, who needed to blend tastefully into the background. I arranged my silver hair in the elegant chignon that had been my signature style since Edgar's funeral, adding the pearl earrings he'd given me for our 10th anniversary. Looking in the bed and breakfast's antique mirror, I saw a woman who appeared to fit perfectly into the role Sophia had envisioned for me. Dignified, but not attention-seeking, well-groomed, but not competitive with younger female relatives, appropriately dressed for a sophisticated celebration without making any bold fashion statements. But appearances, as I'd learned over 7 decades of living, could be profoundly deceiving. At 11 a.m., I drove to the Charleston Museum for a final consultation with Dr. James Whitfield. He'd spent the previous evening creating additional documentation of Evangeline's most significant pieces, and his excitement about their historical importance had only intensified with closer study. "Mrs. Montgomery," he said, greeting me in the museum's conservation lab, "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I need to tell you something important.
These patterns aren't just valuable as individual pieces, they represent a missing link in the evolution of American couture. He spread out enlarged photographs of Evangeline's sketches, pointing to construction details that wouldn't become common in fashion until decades after she'd developed them. Look at this evening gown from 1924, he continued, indicating a dress that incorporated architectural principles of weight distribution and stress management. She was solving engineering problems that most designers didn't recognize until the 1940s. And this day dress from 1927, the way she's manipulating fabric grain to create both structure and fluidity, predicts techniques that wouldn't appear in mainstream fashion until Dior's new look. I studied the sketches with new appreciation, seeing them not just as family artifacts, but as evidence of revolutionary thinking that had been lost to history. James, how significant would this discovery be for fashion scholarship? Museum-changing significant, career-making significant for any institution lucky enough to house these pieces permanently. The kind of discovery that redefines how we understand American fashion development in the early 20th century. The weight of what I was carrying, both literally and figuratively, settled more heavily on my shoulders. These weren't just family heirlooms I was planning to share at a wedding reception. They were historically significant artifacts that belonged in museums, academic studies, and scholarly conferences. But they were also the key to teaching my granddaughter about the creative legacy she'd inherited, and apparently forgotten, and the sacrifices that had preserved that legacy for her generation. James, I want you to know that after tonight's presentation, these pieces will need proper institutional care. Whatever happens with my family, Evangeline's work deserves professional preservation and study. He nodded gravely. Mrs. Montgomery, regardless of the personal dynamics involved, you're making an extraordinary contribution to American cultural history. Evangeline Montgomery will take her place alongside other forgotten pioneers who shaped fashion as we know it. By 1 p.m., I was back at my hotel, trying to eat lunch while my stomach churned with anticipation and apprehension. The ceremony would begin at 4 p.m., followed by cocktails and dinner at the Harbor Club. Patricia had confirmed that the presentation would take place during the reception's informal mingling period, when guests would be most receptive to unexpected entertainment.
And in my heart, after decades of accommodation and self-sacrifice, I carried something I hadn't experienced since Edgar's death. The absolute certainty that I deserved better than the role I'd been assigned in other people's success stories. The woman who walked out of the Magnolia Inn at 3:30 p.m. looked exactly like the grateful grandmother who'd been asked not to embarrass her successful granddaughter. But appearances, as Charleston society was about to discover, could be profoundly deceiving. As I drove through the historic district towards St. Philip's Episcopal Church, I thought about Evangeline Victoria Montgomery and the women who'd worn her revolutionary designs. Suffragettes preparing for political battles, society wives launching charitable organizations, actresses breaking barriers in Hollywood, businesswomen creating opportunities that had never existed before. These women had understood that fashion could be armor, that beauty could serve power, that individual success was most meaningful when it honored the community that had made it possible. Tonight, surrounded by fashion industry leaders and cultural influencers who would determine how Sophia's career developed for years to come, I would channel Evangeline's spirit of female empowerment and creative courage. Tonight, the woman who'd been told to remain invisible would teach everyone present what authentic visibility looked like when it was finally, after years of patient accommodation, allowed to take center stage. The ceremony itself would be beautiful, elegant, exactly what Sophia had envisioned for her perfect wedding day. But the reception that followed would become something none of us had anticipated. A moment of reckoning between past and present, a confrontation between gratitude and shame, a test of whether family legacy could survive the collision with social ambition. As I pulled into the church parking lot and saw the gathering crowd of Charleston's elite mixed with New York's fashion royalty, I felt the last of my doubts dissolve into determination.
Today, Sophia Sterling would marry Alexander Worthington IV in front of everyone's whose respect and acceptance she craved. Tonight, she would discover that the grandmother she'd asked to remain invisible possessed resources, knowledge, and moral authority that demanded a very different kind of respect. The point of no return had arrived. There would be no more accommodation, no more invisible support, no more grateful acceptance of peripheral roles in other people's success stories. Tonight, Vivian Montgomery would finally stop making herself smaller for everyone else's comfort. And everyone present, especially Sophia, would learn what happened when 70 years of patience reached its natural conclusion. St. Philip's Episcopal Church stood like a monument to Charleston's refined sensibilities, its colonial architecture and manicured gardens providing the perfect backdrop for a wedding designed to showcase sophisticated taste and social prominence. As I approached the church steps at 3:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the ceremony, I could see that Sophia had indeed assembled exactly the kind of guest list that would make fashion industry insiders take notice. Anna Wintour emerged from a black SUV, her signature bob and dark sunglasses unmistakable even at a distance. Behind her, I recognized David Morrison from Harper's Bazaar, Elena Vasquez from the Council of Fashion Designers of America, and at least 3 celebrities whose faces regularly appeared in fashion magazines. The parking lot looked like the valet area at New York Fashion Week rather than a Southern church wedding. But what struck me most wasn't the prominence of the guests. It was their behavior as they gathered outside the church. These were people accustomed to being the center of attention at cultural events, yet they were clearly excited about something beyond the typical wedding celebration. I could see small groups engaged in animated conversations, and the energy felt more like anticipation for a significant announcement than standard pre-ceremony socializing. Carolyn Hutchinson appeared at my elbow as I paused to observe the scene. "Mrs. Montgomery, everything is proceeding exactly as planned. Dr. Williamson has confirmed her arrival, and I've had discreet conversations with several key journalists about the possibility of a significant cultural presentation during the reception." How did they respond? With precisely the kind of professional interest we'd hoped for. When fashion and cultural reporters hear about potential historical discoveries involving established contemporary designers, they pay attention. Tonight's audience will be primed for something meaningful. As I entered the church, I caught sight of Sophia in the bridal preparation room through a partially opened door. She looked absolutely radiant in her wedding gown, her own design, naturally, a masterpiece of architectural construction and artistic vision that demonstrated why Sterling Atelier had become so successful. The dress incorporated elements that would have made Evangeline proud. Innovative draping techniques, structural engineering disguised as romantic femininity, and attention to detail that elevated fashion into art. But as I watched Sophia adjusting her veil while surrounded by bridesmaids and attendants, I felt a complex mixture of pride and sadness. This was the culmination of everything we'd worked toward together. Her artistic vision fully realized, her business success validated by the prominence of her wedding guest list, her social acceptance confirmed by marriage into Charleston's established elite. Yet she'd achieved all this while systematically distancing herself from the family foundation that had made it possible. The woman adjusting her veil in that preparation room had become so focused on social acceptance and professional recognition that she'd forgotten the deeper purpose that great design could serve.
Tonight's presentation would remind her, and everyone else present, that authentic artistic legacy wasn't just about impressing wealthy clients or gaining celebrity endorsements. It was about understanding the continuum of creative excellence that connected past and present, honoring the sacrifices that had preserved artistic traditions, and recognizing that individual achievement was most meaningful when it acknowledged the community that had made it possible. The ceremony itself was everything Sophia had envisioned. Elegant, sophisticated, perfectly choreographed to showcase her taste and social connections. Alexander looked appropriately handsome and patrician as he waited at the altar. The music was performed by a string quartet from the Charleston Symphony Orchestra. The flowers had been arranged by the same designer who handled events at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I sat in my assigned seat in the third row, wearing my navy dress and pearl earrings, playing the role of grateful grandmother who understood her appropriate place in the social hierarchy. But in my handbag, protected by acid-free tissue paper, I carried the keys to a presentation that would transform how everyone in that church thought about family legacy and authentic success. As Sophia walked down the aisle on Rebecca's arm, her father having died several years earlier, I felt a moment of genuine maternal pride that transcended all the complicated emotions surrounding our recent interactions. She looked absolutely beautiful, radiant with happiness and confidence, every inch the successful designer who'd built an empire through talent and determination. But I also felt something else as I watched her progress toward the altar. A deep sadness that this moment of triumph was happening in the context of family shame rather than family celebration. Sophia had worked so hard to distance herself from her roots that she'd forgotten how to honor the very foundation that had made her success possible. The ceremony proceeded with the kind of flawless precision that reflected months of professional planning. Vows were exchanged with appropriate emotion and dignity. Rings were presented with perfect timing. The kiss that sealed their marriage was captured by photographers whose work would appear in next month's fashion magazines. As we filed out of the church following the recessional, I could hear conversations that confirmed my assessment of the guest list's significance. Fashion editors discussing upcoming collections, museum curators comparing notes on recent acquisitions, business leaders analyzing market trends in luxury goods. These were exactly the people who would understand and appreciate Evangeline Victoria Montgomery's contributions to American fashion history. These were the cultural influencers who could ensure her legacy received proper recognition and scholarly attention. More importantly, these were the people whose respect Sophia craved most, whose acceptance she'd been chasing through years of social climbing and professional networking. Tonight, in front of this precise audience, she would discover that her family history wasn't a source of embarrassment to be hidden. It was a treasure trove of authentic cultural significance that would enhance rather than diminish her professional standing. The cocktail hour at the Harbor Club provided the perfect opportunity for final reconnaissance and coordination. The venue was stunning, a restored antebellum mansion overlooking Charleston Harbor, with gardens that had been featured in Southern living and ballrooms that regularly hosted society events for the city's most prominent families. I spent the first hour of the reception observing guest interactions and confirming that all elements of tonight's presentation were properly coordinated. Dr. Patricia Williamson had arrived and was discreetly mingling with fashion historians and museum curators, laying the groundwork for the academic credibility that would frame Evangeline's introduction to scholarly attention. Carolyn Hutchinson was working the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent her career managing cultural events for Charleston's elite. I watched her engage in animated conversations with several journalists, clearly generating curiosity about the evening's potential surprises. But most importantly, I was studying Sophia's behavior and emotional state, trying to gauge how she might respond to the presentation I was planning to deliver in less than 2 hours. She looked radiant in her reception dress, a second sterling atelier creation that she'd designed specifically for dancing and socializing. Her interactions with guests demonstrated exactly why she'd become so successful. She possessed natural charisma, genuine artistic vision, and the kind of social intelligence that made powerful people want to support her career. Watching her work the room, I felt a surge of pride that reminded me why I'd been willing to sacrifice so much for her success. Sophia wasn't just talented, she was extraordinary, the kind of creative force who could influence fashion trends and inspire other artists for generations. But I also noticed something that confirmed my decision to proceed with tonight's presentation.
As Sophia moved from group to group, accepting congratulations and discussing business opportunities, she carefully steered conversations away from personal history or family background. When guests asked about her creative influences or artistic development, she focused on formal education, professional mentors, and contemporary inspirations. The sacrifices that had funded her education went unmentioned. The family members who had supported her dreams remained invisible. The generational legacy that had shaped her artistic vision was systematically edited from her success story. This wasn't just social climbing or image management, it was active denial of the very foundation that had made her achievements possible.
At 8:30 p.m., as dinner concluded and guests began moving toward the ballroom for dancing and continued socializing, Caroline approached me with final confirmation that everything was ready. "The presentation space has been prepared," she said quietly. "Audio equipment tested, lighting adjusted, documentation arranged for optimal viewing. Dr. Williamson is ready to provide academic introduction, and I've confirmed that key journalists and cultural figures will be present." "What about Sophia? Does she suspect anything?" Caroline glanced across the ballroom, where Sophia was engaged in animated conversation with Anna Wintour and several other fashion industry luminaries. "She's completely focused on networking and celebration. I don't think she has any awareness that tonight will include anything beyond standard wedding entertainment." I felt a flutter of apprehension mixed with determination. In 30 minutes, I would step into the center of that ballroom and deliver a presentation that would either heal or permanently fracture my relationship with Sophia. There would be no taking back what I was about to do, no undoing the consequences of forcing this confrontation between family pride and social ambition. But as I watched Sophia continue to charm her sophisticated guests while systematically avoiding any mention of the grandmother who'd funded her dreams, I knew I'd made the right decision. Some lessons could only be learned through direct confrontation with consequences, and some relationships could only survive if they were built on mutual respect rather than convenient accommodation. At 8:45 p.m., Dr. Patricia Williamson approached the small presentation area that had been set up near the ballroom's elegant windows. Her academic credentials and professional demeanor immediately attracted attention from the fashion historians and cultural curators scattered throughout the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent her career making significant discoveries in American fashion history. "I've been invited tonight to share a remarkable discovery that will reshape how we understand the development of American couture in the early 20th century." The ballroom conversation gradually quieted as guests realized that something more substantial than typical wedding entertainment was beginning. Anna Wintour, Elena Vasquez, and other fashion industry leaders moved closer to the presentation area, their professional instincts recognizing the possibility of genuinely significant news. "6 months ago," Patricia continued, "I was contacted by a family archivist who discovered a collection of original patterns, sketches, and journals created by Evangeline Victoria Montgomery, a previously unknown couturier who operated in New York during the 1920s and 1930s. I could see Sophia's expression change from polite interest to confusion as she heard our family name mentioned in an academic presentation at her wedding reception. She moved closer to the presentation area, Alexander following behind her, with the slightly bewildered look of someone who hadn't anticipated scholarly lectures during his wedding celebration. "What we discovered," Patricia said, revealing the first enlarged photograph of Evangeline's sketches, was evidence of revolutionary design techniques that predated similar innovations by decades. Construction methods that wouldn't become standard until the 1940s, engineering principles that solved problems most designers didn't recognize until much later in fashion's evolution." The response from the fashion professionals in the audience was immediate and electric. I could hear murmurs of genuine excitement, the kind of professional recognition that confirmed Patricia's assessment of Evangeline's historical significance. But I was watching Sophia's face, seeing confusion give way to something approaching alarm as she began to understand that her wedding reception had somehow become the venue for our family history, the same history she'd asked me to avoid mentioning because it might embarrass her in front of her sophisticated guests. Caroline Hutchinson stepped forward to provide institutional context. The Magnolia Preservation Society is proud to announce that we'll be partnering with the Charleston Museum and the Savannah College of Art and Design to ensure that Evangeline Montgomery's contributions receive proper scholarly attention and public recognition. Now, Sophia looked genuinely panicked. Her wedding reception, carefully choreographed to showcase her professional achievements and social connections, had been transformed into a cultural event celebrating family history she'd been trying to downplay. Alexander leaned over to whisper something in her ear, probably asking how their wedding had suddenly become an academic symposium about his wife's great-great-grandmother's fashion designs. But the crowd's response was overwhelmingly positive. Fashion editors were taking notes, museum curators were asking detailed questions, and celebrities were expressing genuine fascination with the historical discovery being presented at what they'd expected to be a standard society wedding. This was the moment when I knew the evening would unfold exactly as I'd hoped. Sophia's sophisticated guests, the people whose respect and acceptance she craved most, were demonstrating genuine appreciation for our family's creative legacy. The very history she'd been ashamed to acknowledge was being celebrated by the cultural elite whose approval had become so important to her social and professional aspirations. As Patricia's presentation continued, revealing more examples of Evangeline's innovative techniques and historical significance, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: the deep satisfaction of watching authentic value receive proper recognition.
Tonight's presentation wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about education and honor. Sophia was about to discover that her talent wasn't isolated individual brilliance, but part of a continuum of female creative excellence that stretched back generations. More importantly, she was about to learn that family legacy could be a source of professional pride rather than social embarrassment, and that the sophisticated guests whose approval she sought most were capable of appreciating authenticity as much as they valued contemporary success. The stage was set for the evening's climactic moment, when the woman who'd been asked to remain invisible would step forward to claim her proper place in the family story she'd preserved and protected for so long.